Hey everyone, Cursed Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Varchild, the Betrayer, because I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce. Keldor? Is the J silent? I'm not entirely sure. This is a donation deck that comes from Sharak, who says, "Hey Curse, this is a project deck I had in the works I had put on the sidelines. I feel it still needs a bit of a power boost before I take it to the table, and I was hoping you could take a look and give your thoughts on what can be changed to improve its power. And there is a budget of $20 per card, which I'm pretty sure I do stay with. There was a few additions I put at the end that I believe they're about $10 each, so hopefully that's fine, but we'll get to those once we get to the additions. Thank you so much, Sharak, for submitting this deck, and I love Varchild. Varchild has stuck around in my many piles of Magic cards as something that someone that I want to build a deck out of, but I've never gotten to. So this is a great timing. And I also really like this kind of forced combat kind of deck, especially when we get down to like kind of the brass tacks of it, which I believe a monocolor commander allows you to do. And we can kind of use that and just, get to business and start smashing face. So let's get right to it. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Varchild the Betrayer, and why are they our commander for our mono-red forced combat deck? They're a 3-mana, 3/3 human knight, and they have 3 abilities. First one is whenever Varchild deals damage, combat damage to a player, that player creates that many 1/1 red survivor creature tokens. The second ability is the static one that says survivors your opponents control can't block and they can't attack you or a planeswalker you control. And then finally, when Varchild leaves the battlefield, gain control of all survivors. Now this is a really fun kind of mix of abilities, because something that forced combat decks I feel really do miss out on is the ability to generate creatures for your opponents to attack with. It's really easy to go to your opponents these days. It's really easy to force creatures to attack, but it's difficult to ensure that your opponents have creatures that can attack each other without using those creatures to block each other. And Varchild makes that perfect kind of combination of those two abilities, with the added bonus that when Varchild leaves, all of those creatures come to your side. And I really, really do like that. There are cards that kind of do similar things, but none as good as Varchild. So, looking at the deck itself, I do really like it. There's a few things I want to kind of poke at, but the general base is pretty good. Now, the first thing is looking at the curve. The curve is actually really not too bad. At 8 mana, we've got City on Fire, which is a Convoke card. At 9 mana, we have Blasphemous Act, that is also reduced. And one of our 6 mana cards is Ember Cleave, that also goes down in mana cost. So our curve is a little lower than it looks. We're running 34 lands plus 2 MDFCs, and though that's, I think, on the cusp of what I'd like, I wouldn't mind adding at least just one more mountain into the deck. It's still playable, and I think it's still generally fine. We have some ways of creating treasure, and we definitely have some ramps, so it's not the worst. One of the places that I do find something interesting, though, is we're really, really heavy on artifacts. We're actually running 22 artifacts. And though a lot of it is equipment, which creates a kind of equipment sub-theme, there is we're still playing Fire Diamond in a deck that probably doesn't need it at this point. We're still playing, where is it? Crawl Space in a deck that is forcing a lot of combat and therefore not letting that combat come towards you. And then just a lot of equipment. So there is an equipment sub-theme here that I don't feel like there is a lot of support for. So when we get to my additions, you're going to see a lot of the cards that I want to add are to support that equipment sub-theme. And a lot of them are equipment. So I want to kind of support this idea and go a little further with it, because I think it's actually really, really strong. Not only is it fantastic for allowing our commander to hit harder and hit easier with cards like, where is that unblockable helmet? Prowler's Helm. This equipment says equipped creature can't be blocked except by walls. My goodness. And so we've got equipment that allows Varchild to get in, and then we have got equipment that just adds to a bunch of power. So it's good that we have these equipment, and I want to support it a little further. But at the same time, some of these cards here I feel like are kind of detracting from the main game plan. So let's look at a few cards that have caught my eye that I do want to kind of pick at. Funnily enough, a lot of them are mostly in the creature kind of section. One of them is one I constantly have a really hard time with, and that's Kazul, Tyrant of the Cliffs. This is a legendary ogre that punishes your opponents for attacking you and not paying the ogre toll. It's like the troll toll, but it's a little different. But here's the thing, right? There's a bit of a problem and a nombo with Kazul, right? Your opponent's creatures are often forced to attack. Now, this doesn't work with Goad, but if we have something like Fumiko, the low blood out, that forces all opponents' creatures to attack, or I believe there's another one at least with Goblin Spymaster. So all of a sudden these creatures are forced to attack all the time. What they can do is they can direct their attack to you. And then they're going to be asked, hey, do you pay the ogre toll? And when they say no, they've tried to attack, right? The creature has attacked. That's my understanding of it. I could be wrong about it, but I'm pretty sure it forces a situation where your opponents actually can refuse to attack because they cannot or will not pay the toll, and therefore that creature won't attack. So this kind of creates a bit of a safety valve for your opponents, which I don't really like. And then the other thing about it is that even when it is no longer, being used against you, and Kazul is just there to actually protect you, we're at the point that your opponents are presenting lethal threats, and Kazul's there to kind of pressure them into not attacking you, it becomes a ghostly prison or propaganda effect that is almost worse than either of them, right? Because the first thing is, it doesn't prevent the attack. So if your opponent has like a 20/20 dragon that's flying and you have no blockers and they attack into you, they're not going to pay the 3. They're just going to knock you out with the dragon. So the attack isn't prevented. But the second thing is if they need that attack to go through on you, so, they have a big trampler or something like that, and they need to block, and they need to hit you because they feel like that's where the game needs to go. The creation of a 3/3 is really not that much of a disincentive. My goodness, words are tough this morning. It's not as much as a deterrent, let's say, because either they're going to trample through the 3/3, or you're just going to block with the 3/3 and they're not going to mind, or they're going to knock you out anyways, right? Overall, it's just not really going to prevent the damage that I think you need to prevent. It's going to prevent the early hits for pecking at other opponents for little advantages, and you already have the means of preventing that with a bunch of goad and a bunch of forced combat. Finally, and I think this is just kind of, well, actually, not even finally, this is a creature, right? Creatures are easy to remove. It's a 5/4, so a Blasphemous Act, Toxic Deluge, all these kind of abilities not only will destroy Kazul, will destroy the ogres as well, therefore being very, very convenient against that creature. And then finally, they're 5 mana, and 5 mana is a lot for a deck like this, for a creature that doesn't immediately do anything and is reliant on your opponents playing the way you want them to. This card originally came out, I believe it was Worldwake or Zendikar or Rise, and that's when I started. And so I have a lot of nostalgia and affection for this card, so you gotta trust me when I say I do not like this card. From a deep place in my heart, I want to like this card, but I do not like this card. Looking at a few other cards here, Ashling kind of sticks out as being kind of a weird choice here. I know I just did a April Fool's episode on Ashling the Pilgrim, so I get that it's very chic to play her, but I just really do not think this is the deck. You just can't generate the mana to use this in a very strong way, and those you can't even generate the mana, I would say, to casually use her. And by that I mean putting a few +1/+1, not doing it 3 times. Putting 2 +1/+1 counters on her every few turn cycles. This deck can't even do that. So really, you're paying 2 mana for a 1/1, I find, which is just not ideal. Don't get me wrong, I do understand this is a bit of a safety valve, as that when you cause her to explode, she'll destroy all survivors. But what's the situation that you need those survivors out, that you'd rather not just find a way to kill Varchild and just gain control of all those survivors? Just something that's worth considering. Looking at the rest, I generally do like it. I think there's a few cards here and there. Wild Guess is probably not as good as, you know, Tormented Voice, because it needs a 2 red, whereas, and you have a lot of colorless lands, so there's no reason to be playing this when you could be playing the other. I feel like Reforge the Soul just feels kind of weird here. It feels like it's just kind of misplaced as a draw engine or a refreshed hand engine. So I don't really like it here. It's also 5 mana most of the time, which is a lot for this deck. Whereas instead, both of those cards could just be more copies. You know, we have Unexpected Windfall, then we have the other one, the other red one, Big Score, is it? Something like that from New Capenna. That's the same mana cost, except for it's 3 and a red. Does the same thing. And then there's also the 3 mana one from, I believe that one is Ixalan? I could be wrong. But it has a very similar effect where you discard a card, create a treasure, draw 2 cards. And that's a sorcery. So I would play those. I like all of these because they generate, you know, treasure tokens, which I feel like this deck can really use. And otherwise, I think they're just going to be a little better. The other thing that's Chef's Kiss, I think, is a little cute. I think I'd rather this be Bolt Bend, because it's at least 1 mana, where Chef's Kiss holding up 3 mana is tough in this deck. I guess one of the things that I see here that's kind of difficult is that we have a lot of mana sinks and mana heavy things. So like Endless Atlas is here. And don't get me wrong, Endless Atlas is a decent card in a good draw engine in a monocolored deck that doesn't really have card advantage. But like, where are we getting this mana from? When we get to my additions, a lot of the equipment I want to suggest, or a lot of those kind of abilities, are going to be very directly about mana generation. And maybe these abilities like Ashling and Endless Atlas get better when you play something like Braid of Fire, which generates red at like an inopportune step, so you can like funnel that red mana into these abilities. But like that feels like the wrong decision. I feel like don't do that. But I'm just wondering, like, the thing is like, where are we getting the mana to do these things? Like, we need to cast out our commander. We need to play our equipment. We need to then equip the equipment. Then we need to be casting our other spells, and then we need the mana to go into things like Endless Atlas. It feels like we're just not going to have the ability to do so. So, cutting down Endless Atlas, Ashling the Pilgrim, Crawl Space, Mindstone even, Fire Diamond, which is weird. That's the last thing I'm going to say before we go to additions. I'm suggesting we take out some mana rocks, which may feel counterintuitive to what I just said. What I just said was, the deck is suffering from a lack of mana to do all the things it wants to do, and therefore on the list of things I want to take out are mana rocks. So that might feel counterintuitive, so I'm going to explain myself before we go into additions. And maybe I should do more videos, like, if I want to do short videos, I should do videos about these little questions and ideas, because I find these to be really interesting. So this is kind of like, is it survivorship bias? It's the specific thing where, like, we see a problem in the deck. We're not generating enough mana. And so we try to fix it with something like Mana Rock. So we look at Fire Diamond and say, okay, so we can play Fire Diamond to generate more mana, and then to use that mana on the other things we want to do. But on a deck that's so invested on being aggressive, and a deck that really requires our mana plays to be really, really tight because of that, like, shortage of mana, adding another link into the chain is not the solution. So think about it like this. We go from playing, you know, casting 2-drop, 3-drop, playing equipment, playing our commander, attaching the equipment, attacking, you know, this kind of chain of events. And then we're like, okay, to make this easier and put less pressure on our mana, we're gonna find somewhere in there to cast Fire Diamond. And that's being like a bit rough because Fire Diamond comes in tapped. Arcane Signet is obviously a better example, but I'm not suggesting to take it out because it can tap right away. So let's look back at Fire Diamond again. We're gonna find somewhere in that chain of abilities to cast Fire Diamond to relieve the pressure on our mana. And the question becomes, where? Where do we find the room to put Fire Diamond? That not only it doesn't disrupt the chain, but also it's not at a point that 2 mana is better spent somewhere else. So like, for example, imagine one of the things we do is we play Prowler's Helm early, right? At a certain time we find Prowler's Helm, then we play, our commander, and then we do another play, let's say, that leaves us with 2 mana. That 2 mana is probably best used to equip Prowler's Helm to our commander, but you've got a Fire Diamond in hand. Now, in the long term, it makes more sense to play the Fire Diamond because that's going to add an additional mana and it's going to further your plan on every other turn. But by doing so, you're losing the tempo of getting Prowler's Helm onto your commander and getting that first hit in. These games sometimes do not go long. There is a limited amount of times Varchild will be able to hit. It's like an existential thing, like, no one lives forever. There's only so many times you're going to get this effect. Are you going to give up that effect to get a mana rock into play? Now, if you, magically have, if you're lucky enough that all your opponents have blockers, none of your opponents have blockers, then this isn't a problem. But in a situation that they do, this is a real question. And I would argue the problem is not just trying to make this all work together. The problem is Fire Diamond. It's representing a card in your, it's a card in your deck that's kind of holding your deck back. And turn after turn in that game, I really feel like you're going to be looking at Fire Diamond in your hand and not playing it. I'll finish this thought with something a while ago that I heard that really caught me by surprise. I think it was either MTG Goldfish Commander people or the Command Zone, but people were talking about how mana rocks were getting lower and lower in mana cost, which made sense to me because 3 mana is a lot for a mana rock. But they were talking about how 2 mana rocks were becoming 1 mana dorks, which makes sense in like EDH and certain decks. But then other people were saying like they just stopped running mana rocks altogether. And that caught me a little off guard because mana rocks do a lot in this format. And so I want to add to that idea, but I want to twist it a little. I think we should stop thinking of mana rocks as being just essential components of the decks, as like, you playing a whole suite of them. And we should be a little more critical for decks that don't really need them or are held back by them. And this is a deck that I would say outside of Sol Ring and Arcane Signet, this deck is held back by mana rocks. Okay, tangent over, let's go into additions. So before we get to the equipment cards and the equipment sub-theme, I want to support a little more. There's a card here at 5 mana that I really want to suggest. Maybe this should have been the last card, as I like the last card being like my favorite card to suggest, but this is also a very, very good card, so I would find it very hard to not suggest it at the start, and that's Rite of the Raging Storm. This is a creature, this is a 5 mana enchantment that creates a 5/1 every turn for an opponent, and it can't attack you. It has haste and trample. The amount of damage this card does is staggering. I think this is just one of those cards that's just really hard to calculate the damage it does, or you see it once on a board where everyone has 6/6s and you're just like, oh man, this is not a good card. But this is like almost like Painful Quandary, whereas Painful Quandary requires your opponents, like the setup is getting your opponents light on hand resources. Rite of the Raging Storm is getting your opponents light on blocking resources, whether that be creatures or untapped creatures or non-goated can't block creatures, right? So Rite of the Raging Storm, much like what I said at the start about Varchild, gives your opponents the creatures to attack each other with. And 5 power attacking is either costing your opponents a creature a turn like the Abyss, or is doing like 5 damage a turn to your opponents, and maybe some combination of both because of the trample. This isn't even including the fact that you get the right too, which I think is something people tend to forget, that you get the Lightning Rager as well. Sometimes they're just thinking of their opponents getting it, but you get it as well, which means it's a free attack, and that attacks anywhere, whereas your opponents are the ones that cannot, send it your way. Unlike Goat things as well, this doesn't eventually turn on you. Even when you're the only opponent left around, they still can't attack you, which is reasonable. There is an argument to be said that this card is, dangerous in the hands of an Aristocrat's opponent, but to be honest, this deck is already like that, so it won't really make that much of a difference. This is just really, really strong, and I think this should be one of your 5 drops for sure. Very, very powerful, and you'll be very impressed with its effects. All right, let's get into equipment. So the first few cards, and one of them is actually an aura, are going to be all on the same sub-theme, and they're going to be about treasure generation at low mana. So Beamtown Beatstick, and I'm going to skip one to Sticky Fingers, are both really specific cards that I really like because they do 2 things I really like. One, they generate treasures on hit, which is very strong, but 2, they give menace. And that early evasion, especially on your commander, is really, really nice. Now, Beamtown Beatstick, that first equip is the most expensive one. But the idea is if you immediately hit with it, you at least generate that first treasure token, and it's going to be easier to kind of make up for later, and every subsequent hit is going to be better. Whereas, of course, Sticky Fingers doesn't have an equip cost, you just enchant it, and instead of it being like an equipment that stays around, when the creature it's enchanted dies, you just get a card back, so it kind of replaces itself. Both of these, really, really great, really powerful, and that menace is strong. Beamtown Beatstick is just a little better because of that +1 it gives, making Varchild hit 4 for 4 survivors, and that is a substantial difference early on, so I think these are really, really clean. Later in the game, these can be equipped to survivors, these can be equipped to like anything, and you'll be pretty happy just getting an additional treasure. This is the mana rock the deck needs, right? Then in between, you may have seen a few times, is Diamond Pickaxe. I like this. It's just for the mana cost. I think there's also the other pick, I think Gold Vein pick, which is 2 to cast, 2 to equip. Diamond Pickaxe is obviously just a little better for 1 to cast, 2 to equip, and it's indestructible. I don't know if that indestructibility is really that important. I guess it survives like, you know, mass artifact destruction, but otherwise people shouldn't really be targeting this. Yeah, it's kind of it's really you're playing this for the whenever a creature attacks, create a treasure token. So this is just a little different, but it has a lot of stuff to it that I like. It's funny, I think about this now, this is Ixalan after the Omen Path. This should have been Darksteel Pickaxe. I get that it's a Minecraft reference, but the fact that this isn't Darksteel is kind of a, you know, you could have made this a Darksteel card and it would have made sense with the Omen Path, so I think that's kind of a loss there. But this one's very good. This one's possibly the best use of late game extra mana to equip these to survivors, send the survivors in and let them just die, but get a treasure out of them to generate more mana on the next turn. And that's not even including if you have another way to equip cards onto creatures, or if you have a creature that's so big that they're not going to die like the survivors. So very, very good card. Going into 3 mana, and I see, okay, so this was the card I wasn't sure I was going to cut it at $20. This is $20. So I'm definitely pushing the budget here, but the Reaver Cleaver is definitely the card to be adding to this deck. This is the mana rock that I want to see. It creates, like the same as Varchild, it creates that many treasure tokens. This is incredibly powerful, and I think this is the one that if you can budget for, or if you can proxy, this is the one that I want to see play. Just a very, very good card, and I think it works very well with this deck. This solves a lot of that mana sink problem where it is expensive to play and expensive to equip, but even after 1 hit, right, with the +1/+1 on Trample on Varchild, ideally you can get you get immediately 3 or 4 treasure tokens. It's paid for itself mostly, and that turn you can use that treasure to kind of further your board and negate the kind of, you know, the downside of the tempo loss of spending a whole turn equipping this equipment. Be aware, you got to do that when the shields are down a little bit. If your opponents are prepared for interaction, trying to equip the Reaver Cleaver and losing your commander really sucks. So it's a huge loss in mana and tempo, so be careful with this. But it is by far, I think, the strongest addition we could do to the deck. Another one, oh, this is definitely out of, yeah, okay, sorry. This one is definitely out of budget. So this is a sort of Feast of Famine because it works with mana generation, and it works with that enchantment that says pay 5 mana, take another combat step. But I'm just going to skip it for now. It is getting printed back in the future with Assassin's Creed, so maybe if this drops in price, something worth considering of. I was just not aware it got to this price. This is a card I own, so I just assumed the cards I own are worthless. So this is definitely maybe something to keep an eye out in the future. Moving forward, an equipment that I think is very much so missing is Fire Shrieker, is its ability for double strike. I like this equipment for what it does. There is the problem that it is a lot of mana, and it is 3 to play, 2 to equip. It falls into that zone of, once again, if you don't have creatures, and you don't have the extra mana, this card is just gonna rot. Now, the ceiling of this power is really, really high, especially with our commander, so it's kind of hard to gauge. So I wanted to also suggest as an alternative, the two-handed axe. So this works really well, mainly because Sweeping Cleave, I think, is really, really good as a one-time double strike enabler, but also because once you do just cast it and equip it, though you don't get the double strike ability, which is the main thing we want for Varchild, the double its power ability is still pretty much the same thing, because as long as it hits, you still get the same amount of survivors. You do miss out on things like it doesn't combo as well with like the Beamtown Beat Stick or like other on-hit abilities, but this doubling power works exactly the same way for Varchild. Now, it is 3 to play, 2 to equip, just like Fire Shrieker, but I think having Sweeping Cleave there as a one-off kind of use there is just good enough to really get to the point that you're able to, get a huge advantage in one attack as a surprise, or deal with blocks really well, or, change combat in a way that's very disruptive for your opponents. I will note, though it's probably not something a lot of people think about, if all shields are down, this is a 7 mana, multiply your creature's power by 4, right? You cast Sweeping Cleave, you cast the two-handed axe, you equip the two-handed axe, and then you attack knowing you can't be blocked, is doubled twice, right? That's just tremendous damage, and in most cases, should result in your opponent being knocked out of the game. Now, Varchild is kind of unique because their power is so low that this would only do 12 damage, that combo, but if you attach it to anything else, or if you boost Varchild in any meaningful way, like let's say get Varchild to 6, all of a sudden that's 24 damage, that's lethal in Commander, it gets a lot better. Do I think it's reasonable to see this as a one-off multiply by 4 ability? Probably not. It's things, really have to go in a certain way for that to be good. But its utility of being these 3 different cards, just the Sweeping Cleave, just the double power ability, and then putting them together, I think it's good enough to consider this card as definitely a very easy and very strong addition. Then I wanted to talk about some cards I wanted to add for, how do I put this? These are cards I wanted to add that go along with equipment that I think is rather good. Goro Goro, I think, is definitely a card that's a little slept on. I'm always very, very much so surprised that I don't see this around. Now, I am introducing another mana sink card. I get that. But I think this is a different kind of mana sink that I really like. Firstly, Goro Goro is, well costed, 2 mana to play and can attack. Second, that ability of giving all your creatures haste, I think is also just really, really strong and worth the 1 mana. And then the other thing is this creating a dragon spirit, like this quote unquote mana sink, isn't what we traditionally think of as a mana sink. Like, we won't have 30 mana to put into this deck and make 6/5/5. This is more like every now and then when we don't have anything to do, we just spend this mana to create a 5/5, which is a lot better than spending the mana to kind of move around equipment or draw a card. A 5/5 flying dragon is really good, and the modified is really easy to do in this deck. So Goro Goro feels really, really strong here, and I think is just going to be very impressive as just kind of a support card for the haste, with sometimes being able to make dragons. Another one that I think is just notably missing in this kind of equipment deck is Brass Squire, which is a colorless equipment attacher at instant speed. Very, very strong. Once again, if you think of this, think of this as a mana rock. Once again, I'm talking about in this deck, think of mana rock, think of mana generation in a different way. Brass Squire generates mana for you in this deck. Imagine instead of, tap, attach equipment, you control the target creature you control, it says tap, equip this ability at instant speed, and give the mana for that equipment. And if you keep track of that, I think you'll see that Brass Squire generates a lot of mana, even though it technically doesn't. So with that in mind, this is the kind of mana generation I want in the deck. With especially things like the two-handed axe that we looked at earlier, there's a lot of really cool combat tricks, especially like also with the beat sticks and things like that, where you can make sure you get a treasure token. If we use this with double strike or first strike, we get even more effects like this. Very, very strong, and I think absolutely needs to be in here. The last one of the equipment sub-theme is something I really find important, and I think needs to be in more decks that can kind of work with this, and that's Aki Battle Squad. Aki Battle Squad is a phenomenal card. It basically just gives you another combat every turn, with the only caveat is that you need a modified creature. Now, obviously that modified creature needs a free attack or a advantageous attack, which is easy to do with Varchild because there's always an advantage. The free part of it means you either need, that Prowler's Helm or no blockers because of Goad or something. It's very doable in this deck, but once you have Aki Battle Squad you're basically guaranteed 2 attacks with Varchild. After this creature goes off of Summoning Sickness, you can start equipping the Aki Battle Squad as well, modifying it, and all of a sudden getting another pretty good attacker in. And I think that's pretty good, especially with the number of equipment that you have. So this is a card that I'm just very, very much impressed with. And if I was gonna have the curve end somewhere, it would definitely be with this card. This card is just really, really strong and generates so much advantage, right? It's almost better than a lot of the take another turn creatures because it's just so easy to guarantee, and as a 6/6, it's really easy or really hard to deal with. I think of things like Port Razor that require a whole turn cycle to use, or haste, and they're still just a 4/4. And Aki Battle Squad, and I believe the Port Razor needs to hit as well, whereas Aki Battle Squad is just like, hey, did you attack with a modified creature this turn? Cool, you get another attack. And I think that's just amazing. Something else that I wanted to suggest as a utility creature that kind of works best when Varchild has left the battlefield is Hellrider. Hellrider is like a cube staple. I love Hellrider, and I think this is a card that's just very, very good in a deck like this. Hellrider with all your survivors just generates so much damage in a single attack that allows you to potentially knock out an opponent. And what's really nice in Commander that's unlike Hellrider doesn't even need to attack. I was going to say, you can use Hellrider to attack opponent A and attack opponent B with everything else, but you don't actually need to attack with the Hellrider. So even if you're worried about losing the Hellrider, you don't have to. But if one of your opponents is open and you want to attack the other opponent, you can attack the open opponent with the Hellrider and send all of the survivors at the other opponent, hopefully knocking out the more defensive opponents and getting a free hit with Hellrider on the other. Just really, really strong. We need something to do with all these survivors that isn't just skull clamping them or sacrificing them to impulsively draw off of our deck, and Hellrider turns those survivors into a tremendous amount of damage incredibly quickly. So I think this is a card we should be playing for sure. And this is the last one I wanted to talk about. I don't know why I put this here. It should be with the other equipment, but Infiltration Lens is just a very interesting card. This is a card that I see a lot of the time kind of ignored, and I like it because if you play this well, you're going to get a lot of draw triggers. Like, for example, if you put this on Varchild and your opponent has 2 blockers, or like 1 blocker, and they're like let's just say whatever, they're 1/1s or something. They have chump blockers, right? They can't kill Varchild, but they can stop them from getting the trigger. When you equip Infiltration Lens onto them, it becomes a really big choice for them, right? They have to figure out whether or not they want to let you draw 2 cards or let your deck let the engine get going. And I think, considering all of the stuff that we have here, I think this is a really interesting way to cause a little more chaos and sow a little more seeds of confusion on your opponents, of putting them in situations where they don't know exactly the right decision to do. And I think, for example, this is much better than Endless Atlas as a card advantage engine. And as a quote-unquote mana sink, it's a lot more reasonable because it costs the same to cast and equip as the entirety of casting Endless Atlas, which I think Actually, is Endless Atlas 2 or 3? Yeah, it's 2. So much better and a card I really like. And that's it. That's all I have to say for Varchild right now. I think this is an interesting deck. I think to myself sometimes, like, Varchild, I wish Varchild had a second color, though I do appreciate this just being mono red. I wonder, like, I really want to use them, but I really want access to a second color. So hopefully they print something like this again, or I'll be forever using Varchild in the 99 instead. Thank you so much, Turok. The deck looks great. I think it's at the point that the next step would be to do some testing, because when you talk about like the power level being not where you want, I wonder to the degree of like where that power level is going to land. Like, this is a deck with Dockside Extortionist in it, right? Where are we going to go for power beyond this, right? Outside of putting more, you know, in like putting Godo and what is the helmet that makes Godo and them infinite attacks. That would be like the next step if you really want to rocket up the power of this deck. Or playing more tutors, more equipment tutors, more like gamble effects. That would be the next step to go in. But I feel like already the deck's kind of in a good place. So my suggestion is going to be jam the deck a little bit and then kind of feel it out, because perhaps what you're going to find is maybe it's too much in the equipment sub-theme and you're not really going to like where it goes. Or maybe you want to be able to kind of, you know, have more generic win conditions, like I said with Godo. So you're going to need to test it a little bit to find out. And when you're done that, let me know. Send me the deck again. Tell me how it went, because I love Varchild and I'm always happy to see them doing well. I think one thing that I keep forgetting to note is Field of Ruins should be the Demolition Field or Demolition Ruins. I forget. They share a name. It's either Field or Ruin. I always forget which one it is. But the Demolition version of this doesn't ramp your other two opponents, because this one destroys target non-basic and then each player. So 2 opponents get a free land, whereas the Demolition version, only you and the player whose land is destroyed gain a land. So something just worth considering. Okay, and I'll leave that there. Thank you so much for the deck, and happy deck building and good luck. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you, and good luck in brewing and building.